Well, some of it's to do with practical issues, very practical issues. Most journalists, foreign journalists, are based in West Jerusalem. They hang out together with other journalists in West Jerusalem. Many of the journalists have some kind of partisanship, an emotional connection, if you like, to Israel. There's the need for access. Journalists need access, and the access they need is mainly to Israeli spokespeople, not to the Palestinians. So they need to maintain a certain closeness to the Israeli regime. There are the pressures from their editors back in their head offices in Washington, New York, London, wherever it is. Those editors will mostly be reading the American media. And so this filters right across the media spectrum. You see these kind of biases that come from, if you like, what I would call the Washington consensus. Now, the Washington consensus isn't a media consensus, it's a political consensus. It comes from the political leadership, the White House, ultimately, in Congress. And they have a very strong commitment to Israel. We see that. We see that in the funding that Israel gets. We see it in the diplomatic cover it gets. We see that when the Palestinians try and pass a resolution in the UN against the settlements, the Americans veto it. When they try and go for statehood, which is supposed to be the outcome we all want from the peace process, the US intimidates everybody else, so they don't even need to block it. But there's no doubt that the American political system sides with Israel always. Most journalists are worried about their careers. They're worried about keeping on side with their editors. The editors are worried about the access that they have in Washington. So the whole thing kind of trickles down. So it starts with the politicians, but it filters all the way down to the ordinary journalist. Everybody feels they've got to play on side on this. This is an American issue, in my view. Europe plays along with the American position because it doesn't want to antagonize the US. So really the question is, why is the US so committed to the Israeli position? And I think there are many, many reasons for that. One could argue that there are strong American interests in the region historically that put a pressure on the American system, or historically put a pressure on the American system, to political systems to support Israel. Nowadays, one has to look at it and say, America seems to have decided that it would be worthwhile having a Palestinian state. This is a concession I think the American political system would make, but doesn't. And so the question is, why doesn't it? Why doesn't it follow through on its own interests in this question? And this seems to come down to, in many ways, the power of the lobby. This becomes an issue of finance and money. Most Congress people are clearly terrified of upsetting the lobby and then attracting the kind of negative publicity which the lobby can bring their way. The lobby's shown in its history that it will target any congressperson who doesn't toe the line on his support for Israel. They can isolate that congressperson and then direct money against them, finance their opponent, and lose them their seat. So it takes a very brave congressperson to stand up and take that on. Lobby is a big amorphous thing. I mean, it involves what one might call the military-industrial complex, to quote Eisenhower. But if in its most naked and concentrated form, it's AIPAC. But there are also other lobbies that target in other ways. We've already spoken about the media. Well, there are lobby groups specifically targeting journalists, and particularly American journalists, to make sure that they don't stray from the party line. There are a number of them: Anti-Defamation League, Camera, Honest Reporting, and their job is to intimidate the journalists. So you have the journalists who are very intimidated. You have the politicians who are worried they're going to lose their seats. Once you've got the media and the politicians, really you've got the system, and you've got the military, of course, who are largely sympathetic. So there's very little pressure in the system to oppose Israel. It's very clear what Israel wants. It wants all the land, and it wants the Palestinians entirely expelled from that land. That's what it wants. Now the question is what it can get. It can't just expel them. It can't commit some kind of massive war crime straight out. It knows that. And so the process in Israel has always been incremental. It was Moshe Dayan, a very famous Israeli general, once termed it creeping annexation. It was the idea of if you like to go right back to the very beginning of Zionism, The terminology was different then. It was the idea of what they called dunam after dunam, dunam being a measure of territory from the Ottoman times. But the idea was, or another phrase that was used, goat after goat, if you like, maybe a little bit more graphic. But it was the idea of taking one thing after another. If you just kept on taking small things, but were always taking those things, slowly this would accumulate. This would become large areas you'd taken, but nobody would really notice. Or people would notice, but there wouldn't be enough political will to stop it. And this has been Israel's modus operandi, if you like. They've used this creeping annexation to slowly take more and more land away from Palestinians, concentrate them into smaller and smaller areas of the West Bank, before Gaza as well, although of course Gaza now doesn't actually have direct occupation in that way, but it's surrounded on all sides, and it's a very small area anyway. You see it happening in Jerusalem as well, where Palestinians are being contained in very small areas. So you have a rapidly growing Palestinian population confined to very, very small areas of historic Palestine, if you like, tiny areas now. And Israel manages to do this in such a way that the international community feels no need to really stop it. There's some need to make noises against it. There's a need to, if you like, accommodate popular opinion that's against it. But there's no real will to tackle it, to force Israel to change course. So Israel keeps doing it.